Jesus was a great moral teacher. It sounds respectful, it sounds balanced, it even sounds generous, until the question of who Jesus claimed to be enters the room. Then the compliment begins to tremble, because it may not be a conclusion at all. It may be a hiding place, praise offered in precisely the amount required to avoid a verdict. It is easy to admire selected sayings. Love your enemies, forgive, reject hypocrisy, care for the forgotten. These teachings can be lifted from the recorded portrait, polished, and displayed as moral wisdom. But appreciating isolated words is not the same as judging the person who speaks them. The sources do not present Jesus merely as a dispenser of admirable maxims. They present a teacher whose authority, actions, demands, and identity are entangled with his moral vision. Whether that portrait is historically trustworthy is a separate question, and it must be asked, but it cannot honestly be evaded by quietly removing whatever makes the compliment uncomfortable. That is why we will examine Lewis's reasoning rather than repeat it as a slogan. His argument has force, but force is not proof of every premise. Logic may show what follows. If the recorded claims substantially belong to Jesus, logic alone cannot establish that they do. A courtroom must first consider the testimony before it can confidently classify the person described by it. So 4 tests await us. Can Jesus retain moral authority if his identity-bearing claims are reduced or discarded? What exactly does the recorded portrait attribute to him? How do those claims function within their historical world rather than ours? And what happens when Lewis's familiar alternatives face their strongest rivals' later development, sincere error, deception, metaphor, misunderstanding, or reconstruction? We will not demand blind agreement, but neither will we permit vague admiration to masquerade as an answer. The demonstrated audience interest in consequential, Christ-centered engagement with Lewis establishes only that this question still matters to many people. It validates no historical claim and proves no doctrine. Interest is not evidence. It is merely a reason to investigate carefully. If you value honest encounters between Christian faith and reason, continue with this channel and tell us in the comments, what question about Jesus do you find hardest to dismiss? Because the issue is not whether Jesus can be made agreeable after difficult features are removed. The issue is whether the great teacher verdict can account for the whole portrait without arbitrary editing. Once the teacher's place within his teaching is restored, what remains of the compliment and what remains of the teacher? The safety of the compliment depends upon a quiet act of selection. We hear a saying that matches what we already recognize as good, and we approve it. But agreement with a sentence is not yet trust in a teacher. You may accept a lesson because its reasoning convinces you, because experience confirms it, or simply because it echoes convictions you brought with you. In each case, the saying has passed your examination. You remain the judge. To receive someone as a moral authority is more demanding. It means allowing the teacher to question not only your conduct, but also your standards of judgment. It means the uncomfortable possibility that when his vision conflicts with yours, the error may not be his. This is where admiration becomes costly. A Jesus who is permitted to speak only when he agrees with us is not directing us. He is being directed by us. Imagine a house with beautiful rooms, graceful windows, and walls that still appear sound after a central supporting beam has been removed. The surviving beauty does not demonstrate structural integrity. The decisive question is whether that beam was merely one feature among others, or whether the weight of the house depended upon it. So it is with the recorded portrait. If the material concerning Jesus' identity is incidental ornament, it may perhaps be removed while much of the moral instruction remains. But if his person and authority carry the weight of his demands, then reduction does not preserve the teaching, it alters its structure. We must keep that if firmly in place. We have not yet shown that every identity-bearing statement attributed to Jesus is historically authentic. We have not decided whether some language is metaphorical, shaped by its setting, misunderstood, or developed later. Those questions cannot be settled by intensity, tradition, or preference. They require evidence and context. But uncertainty about attribution does not justify silent deletion. It demands investigation. Are we receiving the teacher or correcting him? Are we learning from his moral vision or borrowing only the portions that already agree with ours? Are we following a voice that may challenge us or assembling a voice that can never do so? If Jesus is stripped of every claim that threatens our control, we may believe we are admiring him when we are admiring our own reflection. This does not prove that Jesus is divine. It does not even prove that the recorded portrait preserves every claim precisely as he gave it. It proves something narrower, but essential. Great moral teacher is not a neutral refuge between faith and rejection. It is a verdict that must explain its selection. The next task, then, is precision. We must distinguish moral instruction from claims of personal authority, and both from identity-bearing material. Only then can we ask whether the speaker can truly be separated from what he speaks. The separation begins with 4 kinds of material. First, there is general moral instruction, teaching about what human beings ought to do, desire, resist, and become. Such instruction may be examined for its wisdom even by someone who remains uncertain about the teacher. Second, there is personal, moral authority. Here the recorded voice does more than recommend a principle. It speaks as one entitled to expose motives, redefine faithfulness, pronounce judgment, and demand obedience. The issue is no longer only whether an idea is good. It is whether this person possesses the authority from which the demand is made. Third, there is identity-bearing material, words, actions, roles, and narrative patterns that contribute to the question of who the speaker is. Not every such feature is an explicit declaration. A portrait can communicate identity cumulatively through what a person assumes, permits, claims, performs, or places at the center of his mission. Fourth, there are demands concerning the hearer's response to the speaker himself. These are not simply instructions to practice certain virtues. They bind the moral decision to one's posture toward the person issuing the call. If that connection belongs substantially to the portrait, then the teacher is not merely pointing beyond himself to an independent code. His place within the message becomes part of what the message asks us to confront. Do not blur these categories, but do not pretend they are unrelated. General instruction can be assessed sentence by sentence. Personal authority, identity, and demanded response create a cumulative question. A handful of attractive maxims cannot settle that question, because the question concerns the character portrayed across the material. One cannot answer an argument about the whole voice by selecting only the sentences that would sound equally comfortable without the speaker. Yet another distinction is essential. We are describing what the texts portray. We are not thereby certifying that every element is a verified, verbatim statement of the historical Jesus. A textual portrait is evidence to be examined, not a conclusion smuggled past examination. Its sources, development, language, purpose, and setting still matter. Historical inquiry must ask, what is early, what is central, what is substantially attributable, and what may reflect interpretation or later shaping. This produces the fork that honest reasoning must preserve. If the identity-bearing material is marginal, late, or foreign to the historical teacher, then Lewis's argument loses much of its force. The claimant whom his logic classifies may be largely the product of the portrait rather than the person behind it. But if that material is central to the sources and substantially authentic, the merely great teacher verdict becomes increasingly unstable. We would then be facing not a sage surrounded by accidental exaggeration, but a moral voice whose authority and identity belong to its structure. That is the condition Lewis's reasoning requires. The portrait must contain claims strong enough to demand classification, and those claims must belong substantially to Jesus. Keep both premises visible. With the categories now separated, we can enter Lewis's decision tree without mistaking conditional logic for historical proof. Then, let the argument proceed with its conditions exposed. If Jesus made extraordinary claims about his own identity, if he intended them in the strong sense the recorded portrait gives them, and if those claims belong centrally to his moral voice, they cannot be treated as morally weightless. Their truth or falsity changes our judgment of the speaker. Suppose the claims are false. Were they knowingly false? Then we are dealing with deliberate deception at the very point where the teacher demands trust, obedience, and a response to himself. A person may speak many true sentences while lying about his own authority. But great moral teacher becomes a strained verdict when the alleged falsehood is woven into the authority by which the teaching is delivered. Were the claims false but sincerely believed? Then deception is not the charge, yet the problem does not disappear, it changes form. A person gravely mistaken about his own identity and place in the moral order may still display insight, compassion, and courage. Human beings are not reduced to a single error, but the greater the mistake, and the more centrally it governs his demands upon others, the harder it becomes to grant him uncomplicated moral authority. This is where Lewis used the blunt language of a lunatic. We should understand its rhetorical function without treating it as a clinical diagnosis. Mental illness is not a synonym for wickedness, stupidity, or spiritual fraud, and no responsible argument should caricature those who suffer from it. The fairer question is whether the portrait is best explained by profound delusion or serious incoherence, a sincere claimant whose understanding of himself was radically false. Now suppose the claims are true. Then merely a great teacher fails in the opposite direction. It does not insult Jesus by accusing him of deceit or delusion. It diminishes him by placing him in a category too small for the reality granted. If the identity-bearing claims are true, the teacher is not simply one wise voice among others. The hearer's response to him becomes part of the moral issue. Lewis's three doors therefore exert real pressure. They expose the teacher-only compromise as an attempted exception, not a completed explanation. It wishes to preserve the authority, discard the identity, and avoid explaining the relationship between them. It wants the benefit of the portrait without bearing the cost of classifying its central figure. But do not make the argument prove what it has only assumed. It does not establish that Jesus made the relevant claims. It does not establish that later hearers understood them correctly. It does not establish that strong language was literal rather than metaphorical, contextual, or interpretively shaped. And it does not establish that the claims are true. The argument classifies consequences once those premises are granted. It can close an easy escape. It cannot tell us, by logic alone, which remaining explanation is historically correct. And now the strongest challenge steps forward. What if the historical Jesus never made the claims the three doors ask us to judge? What if the portrait grew? What if later memory, interpretation, worship, controversy, or misunderstanding placed upon Jesus claims he did not make, or gave stronger meaning to words he did speak? That objection is not cowardice. It is not rebellion. It challenges the argument at its historical foundation. A decision tree about a claimant cannot begin until we have reason to believe the claimant actually made the claims being classified. Consider a trial. A witness attributes astonishing words to the accused. The court cannot immediately ask whether those words reveal honesty, delusion, or guilt. It must first ask whether the witness heard accurately, remembered reliably, understood correctly, and reported faithfully. Classification comes after assessment. Otherwise, the accused may be judged by a statement originating not with him, but with the testimony about him. This distinction matters. One critic may grant that Jesus made and intended the relevant claims, yet reject Lewis's inference from them. Another may accept the inference conditionally while denying that the historical premise has been established. These are not two versions of the same objection. The first disputes the reasoning. The second disputes whether the reasoning has been applied to the right historical subject. They require different answers. And both believers and skeptics carry an evidentiary burden. It is not enough to say the portrait must be reliable because it is scripture. That may express a theological conviction, but it does not supply the historical argument to someone who does not already share it. Yet the opposite shortcut is equally careless. Extraordinary material cannot be dismissed as late invention merely because it is extraordinary. Disbelief is not dating. Suspicion is not source criticism. Calling something legendary does not demonstrate when, where, or why it arose. What evidence would matter? Evidence bearing upon the sources, their relation to earlier testimony, the development of the portrait, the meaning of its language, and whether its identity-bearing features are early, central, and substantially attributable to Jesus. But honesty requires an admission. The research supplied for this argument contains no source-critical or historical evidence capable of resolving those questions. No confident conclusion should be manufactured where the necessary support has not been provided. Until further evidence is added, any judgment about attribution must remain provisional. But notice what follows. If the strong claims cannot be historically secured, Lewis's formulation loses its immediate target. It does not follow that Jesus has therefore been recovered as merely a great moral teacher. Which Jesus has been recovered? On what evidence? With what authority? A reduced portrait must still be justified positively. It cannot be created simply by removing whatever demands explanation. The source objection therefore relocates the inquiry. It does not settle Jesus' identity. It asks what portrait of him history can responsibly sustain. And even if we provisionally grant that substantial identity-bearing claims remain, another question waits. Must they mean deception, delusion, or divinity, or could mistake, metaphor, and misreading open further possibilities? The field must widen. A false identity claim need not arise only from calculated deceit or psychiatric disorder. A person may be sincere, morally serious, and profoundly mistaken. Religious conviction can misjudge events, vocation, expectation, or personal significance without collapsing into madness. That possibility deserves more than a dismissive label. But it also deserves examination. What was the mistake? How central was it? How did it shape the authority claimed over others? Sincerity may remove the accusation of fraud. It does not make consequential error morally irrelevant. Then there is metaphor. Perhaps language that appears absolute was symbolic, representative, or rhetorical. Perhaps Jesus spoke as one embodying a divine purpose, without identifying himself with God in the later sense. Perhaps words changed force as they crossed languages, memories, communities, and interpretive settings. Perhaps hearers mistook role for identity, mission for essence, or dramatic proclamation for literal self-description. These are serious semantic possibilities. But metaphor is not a solvent that automatically dissolves difficult claims. Which expressions are metaphorical? What would they have meant within their setting? Does that reading illuminate the surrounding material, or merely reduce whatever troubles a modern listener? Misreading must identify the reading that went wrong and offer a better one. Translation and transmission may explain alteration, but they cannot be invoked as invisible machinery producing any desired result. A different proposal portrays Jesus as a prophet, reformer, or apocalyptic figure, morally compelling in important respects, yet mistaken about some expectations or about his role within them. That portrait is possible in principle. It may preserve portions of the teaching while denying the strongest interpretation of the teacher, but it is not established merely by being named. It must show which material belongs to Jesus, which does not, how his authority functioned, and why the resulting reconstruction is historically preferable. Deliberate deception remains logically possible as well, yet suspicion is not evidence. To call Jesus a deceiver without explaining motive, method, moral character, and the portrait's development is no more rigorous than declaring him divine because the alternatives feel offensive. So let every candidate face the same questions. Can it account for the identity-bearing material? Can it explain the moral authority that admirers continue to grant? Does it fit the relevant historical context? How much must be reinterpreted, removed, or reconstructed before the explanation works? And does it clarify the whole portrait, or survive only by renaming the difficulty? Lewis's three doors should therefore neither be repeated as automatic proof, nor discarded as useless. They should open into an expanded decision tree: sincere error, deception, metaphor, misunderstanding, later shaping, reconstruction, or divine identity. More branches create fairness, not escape. Each must bear explanatory weight. And now the original admiration returns with sharper force. Which of these widened alternatives can preserve Jesus as morally authoritative, and which quietly keeps the praise only by replacing the teacher who commanded it? Then ask what the admiration actually rests upon. Is Jesus called great because several sayings agree with values we already hold, because the wider moral vision displays a coherence that commands respect, or because we trust the speaker as one entitled to correct our values when they fail? These are different judgments. The first praises agreement, the second recognizes a moral vision, the third submits to authority. Suppose a physician gives several sensible instructions, but joins them to a disputed claim of unique authority and a diagnosis that governs the entire treatment. We may keep the advice about rest or restraint because it appears reasonable, but preserving a few instructions does not settle whether the central diagnosis is trustworthy, nor can we call the physician authoritative while accepting only those prescriptions we would have chosen without him. Either the disputed authority belongs to the integrity of the treatment, or it does not. That question requires examination. So the conditional fork remains. If the identity-bearing material is central, substantially authentic, and inseparable from Jesus' demands, removing it produces a safer figure, but not necessarily the historical teacher. If that material is secondary, misunderstood, or inauthentic, then its removal may be justified. But justified by what? By evidence concerning sources, language, development, and setting, not by the convenience of the result. This is not neutral admiration. It is selection, and selection must defend its rule. Which words are retained? Which are reduced? Which are assigned to later interpretation? Why? If agreeable teaching is presumed authentic, while costly authority is presumed invented, the method has already decided what it pretends to discover. The resulting sage may be humane, measured, and comfortably modern. He may also be the creation of the person admiring him. This is where investigation becomes personal. Will we permit a teacher to contradict us? Will we allow his moral vision to examine the standards by which we examine him? Or is greatness granted only where agreement already exists? A student who reserves the right to reconstruct the teacher whenever obedience becomes costly has not placed himself under instruction. He has made himself the final authority. None of this proves the identity-bearing claims true. Admiration is not evidence of divinity, but neither is discomfort evidence of later invention. Every inclusion and exclusion needs a principled basis. Every surviving portrait must explain not only what it preserves, but why it is entitled to remove the rest. The reduced moral sage is therefore not an innocent starting point. It is one hypothesis among others, carrying its own burden. And before any disputed word is accepted, softened, or discarded, a further discipline is required. We must ask what that word, that authority, and that demanded response would have meant within the world in which Jesus spoke. That world cannot be treated as scenery. Jesus did not speak as a generic life coach, a spiritual influencer, or a case study prepared for contemporary psychology. Those categories may feel familiar. They may even capture fragments of the portrait. But familiarity is not accuracy. Translate him too quickly into the language of our age, and we may understand only the figure we have translated, not the person the sources intend to describe. It is like reading an ancient map after replacing every original place name with a modern one. The lines remain, the page remains. The reader may still trace roads and borders, yet the intended landscape has vanished, because the names that located those features within their own world have been exchanged for names belonging to ours. We appear to have clarified the map. In fact, we have made it point somewhere else. So historical context must do more than decorate a conclusion already chosen. What did particular titles suggest to those who heard them? What religious hopes, fears, symbols, and expectations gave authority language its force? What did an action communicate within that setting? When did a claim sound conventional, provocative, symbolic, or astonishing? How would Jesus' audience have distinguished prophetic vocation from personal identity, representation from equality, moral instruction from a demand carrying greater authority? Do not assume that context always reduces the claim. Sometimes it may. Language made absolute by later readers may prove more limited, more symbolic, or more closely tied to an immediate controversy. But context can cut the other way. Words that sound modest to modern ears may carry far greater consequence when restored to the expectations, symbols, and religious boundaries of their first hearers. Historical setting is not a machine for shrinking Jesus, nor is it a device for enlarging him. It is a discipline for hearing before judging. And here the present inquiry must confess its limit. No contextual evidence beyond the necessity of this test has been supplied. We have not been given the historical material required to determine how specific titles, symbols, claims, or responses functioned in Jesus' world. Therefore, no contextual verdict should be invented. This section can define the questions. It cannot honestly manufacture their answers. That restraint binds believer and skeptic alike. The defender may not use ancient context as a mysterious amplifier that makes every disputed expression divine. The critic may not use it as a fog in which every difficult claim disappears. Both must show their work. Jesus cannot be made easier to classify by first making him a stranger in his own world. Context is not an escape hatch for preference. It is a common test. And now, every surviving explanation must face it, alongside moral coherence, source attribution, and explanatory scope. Bring the tests together. 5 explanations remain. Jesus may be a moral teacher whose portrait received a later identity-bearing overlay. He may be a sincere claimant in serious error. He may have knowingly deceived. He may have been misunderstood because metaphor, role, and representation hardened into claims he never intended. Or the portrait may be substantially right. His identity-bearing claims may be true. Do not choose among them by asking which feels safest. Ask which explains the most, which accounts for the moral vision, the personal authority, the demanded response, and the identity-bearing material, which fits the historical setting once the relevant evidence is supplied, which preserves moral coherence, which depends least upon selective removal, which can justify what it retains, what it softens, and what it rejects. The reduced teacher hypothesis may succeed if the strongest material is late, secondary, or foreign to Jesus, but it fails if it simply removes everything that prevents the desired conclusion. Sincere error may explain conviction without fraud, but it must show how a serious mistake at the center of claimed authority leaves that authority intact. Deception may explain false claims deliberately made, but it must account for the moral character and purpose of the resulting portrait rather than merely attach a dark motive. Metaphor or misunderstanding may explain why strong language was heard too strongly, yet it must identify the disputed language, recover its intended meaning, and explain the surrounding actions and responses. A possible misreading is not automatically a probable one. Naming another door does not prove that it opens onto a coherent account. Then, consider divine identity. If the identity-bearing features are early, central, substantially attributable to Jesus, correctly understood, and inseparable from his demands, the divine explanation gains extraordinary scope. It does not preserve the moral teacher by cutting away the claimant. It explains why the person and the teaching stand together, why response to him carries moral weight, and why reducing him produces persistent strain. Under those conditions, divine identity can emerge as the most coherent explanation. But keep the condition visible. The material supplied here does not independently establish those historical premises. It has provided standards for judging the evidence, not the evidence required for a final historical demonstration. The believer must not turn conditional coherence into automatic proof. The skeptic must not turn an unmet evidentiary burden into proof of reduction. Intellectual honesty cuts both ways. And emotional reluctance settles nothing. A conclusion may demand too much and still be true. It may offer hope and still be false. Personal cost reveals the stakes. It does not determine the evidence. Lewis's enduring force is here. He demands an explanatory verdict. His argument requires historical support, but it will not permit vague respect to masquerade as an answer. You may reject the divine Christ, but an informed rejection must explain the portrait better, with greater coherence and fewer arbitrary removals. Once that demand is faced, the last neutral refuge disappears and the question turns toward the one who must respond. Now the argument crosses into conscience. If Jesus is only an insightful teacher, you may receive what persuades you and decline the rest. If he is a figure reconstructed from later claims, you must show where the reconstruction began and why. If he was sincerely mistaken, deliberately deceptive, or fundamentally misunderstood, each verdict carries its own burden, and if he is God, then admiration is not enough, approval is not allegiance, respect is not worship. So name the position you are actually taking, not the position that asks least of you, not the one inherited without examination. What evidence does it depend upon? What material must it explain? What does it preserve? And what must it remove? Can it account for the moral voice, the authority, the identity-bearing features, and the response demanded of the hearer? Do not hide uncertainty, but do not baptize avoidance as uncertainty either. Perhaps you conclude that the case remains historically unresolved. Then continue the inquiry honestly. Examine attribution, language, context, and development. Perhaps you conclude that the portrait is false. Then say so plainly and accept what follows. Jesus should not retain an authority denied at its center. But if you conclude that the portrait is substantially trustworthy and that the divine explanation best accounts for it, then the question has changed. You are no longer deciding whether Jesus deserves a place among your admired teachers. You are being asked whether you will trust him. The Christian response is not triumph in debate. It is humility. It is repentance, the surrender of the claim that we are sufficient judges and masters of ourselves. It is trust in Christ, not because the argument has made every question disappear, but because truth has become personal. And it is the reception of grace, not a prize for intellectual success, not a wage for moral achievement, but mercy received by those who know they need it. Do not let fear decide against him. Do not let promised comfort decide for him. Follow the truth with courage. And if the truth leads to Christ, do not stop at admiration. Come honestly. Trust him. Receive what you cannot earn. If you are willing, write, I am willing to follow the truth about Christ wherever it leads. Or name the conviction you are still examining. Continue exploring faith and reason with this channel, not to remain forever at a safe distance, but to seek faithfully. Then let the presenter fall silent. The final word belongs not to the argument, but to Christ, and the response remains yours.